Okay, listen, thank you all very much for coming. Dirty, rotten night. I'm going to speak a wee bit about Ulster Scots. My name's Logan. I have an interest in Ulster Scots. I've done some writing, I've done a bit of broadcasting. But primarily I'm a lover of Ulster Scots, an enthusiast. So I'm going to talk a wee bit, then I'm going to read a wee bit of poetry, then I'm going to read a wee bit of prose. Ulster Scots. Ulster Scots. Or as I personally prefer, the Hamely tongue. That's a name given to it by James Fenton, the poet and lexicographer, and very much the Dr. Johnson of the Hamely tongue. Dr. Ian Adamson, who I'm delighted to say is here this evening, the distinguished historian and linguist, coined the term Ullans, which gives our academy its title. Now, Ullans is derived from Lallans, which is the version of Scots spoken in the lowlands of Scotland, and Ulster. So Ulster Lallans becomes Ullans. And academy, that's a much misunderstood word, originating in the name academe, the wood where the Greek philosopher Plato taught, and that sense is retained in the phrase the groves of academe, meaning in the world of study and education. My preferred classical definition of an academy, and the one which fits us best, I think, is an association or an institution for the advancement of art, literature, language, or science. There are other definitions, but that's the one I like best. And although our title is the Ullans Academy, we are committed to all languages used in this island. I'm here to talk about Ulster Scots. Dr. Rory Blaney will be giving a talk about Irish next month. And King Billy and St. Patrick will have their turn in February and March. Their day will come, so to speak. But back to Ulster Scots. And just to break up the talk slightly, I intend to look at a few individual words which may be familiar to some of you, and examine them in slightly more detail. And the first word I want to look at is footer. There's a first footer at New Year. There's a left footer or a right footer. I'm never quite sure which it is, or is it both, which indicates somebody from the other side of the sectarian divide. You could be a 6-footer. You can have it at the bottom of your computer printout, I'm told. But these words are in some way related to the word foot, the thing that resides at the end of your leg. No, I mean the Ulster Scots footer, the verb to work or to take action ineffectually or tentatively. You might hear the phrase, "quet your footerin'," or the noun, a person with a tendency to footer. Don't go near him, he's only a footer. I've heard it used by a wide range of people in all walks of life. But where does footer come from? Well, Scotland, of course. But the Scots had it from the medieval French. French, the language of love. And indeed, footer comes from the French word foutrer. That's a word which in polite company is best rendered as the physical act of love. In less polite company, it might be rendered as another F word. I wonder if people would be so keen to use the word footer if they really understood what it meant. Anyway, the Hamely tongue, Ullans, Ulster Scots. Since I got involved by Jaggers, I have heard all the criticisms, and I've never met so many experts, so many knowledgeable authorities. It's not a language, they say. It's a dialect. I do have a standard response for that. I asked them to define a language and define a dialect and critique the differences between them in under 60 seconds. I generally inquire, what are your linguistic qualifications? Have you studied Noam Chomsky, Steven Pinker? I know I haven't studied these people, but it's a fantastic response, and it usually kills that line of criticism pretty quickly. But there are worse accusations, I'm afraid. It's bad English. It's bad English with a Ballymena accent. I find that one particularly hurtful. It's Protestant Irish. It's a totally made-up language. Now, this latter seems to imply that Ulster Scots is unique in being made up, whereas I would contend that all languages are made up. So to accuse Ulster Scots of that is not really a true criticism. And while I'm anxious not to disrespect the beauty of language, or indeed the music of language, it should be borne in mind that language is primarily a medium for the transfer and recording of thought. A thought comes from my mind and into your mind, and the methodology we use for that is language. Without entering into an argument that I have neither the intellect nor the inclination to participate in, I would contend that Ulster Scots informs, or some might say infects, much of our everyday speech here in Northern Ireland. Now, some of you may feel that I'm talking key, talking out of me ears, that I'm only an ignorant slabber, a ganch. And thank God in a liberal democracy, that is your perfect right. You're fit to argue down my throat if you like. Many of you perhaps will be familiar with slabber, ganch and key. But I'm not here to talk about our politicians tonight. I'm here to talk about Ulster Scots. The key point about these words is they are not standard English words. The dictionary definition of a language, it's a method of communication, either spoken or written, consisting of the use of words in a structured and conventional way. The communication of thoughts and feelings through a system of arbitrary signals, such as voice sounds, gestures, and written symbols. We need to be clear. The language debate is over. No greater authority than the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages have made that call after due consideration. I encourage you all to challenge their authority, to rubbish their findings, to mock their credentials. But please, tell them, not me. I didn't make the decision. They did. Ulster Scots. It's also about the relationship between Ulster and Scotland. I like to say there has been intercourse between Ulster and Scotland for thousands of years. Many social, political and personal connections covering the rising and falling of peoples and kingdoms. Many parts of Ulster are closer to Scotland than they are to Belfast. And back in the day, sea journeys could be much faster than roads. Trade, intermarriage, workers seeking work, these are the traditional reasons for emigration and immigration. And this hasn't changed much over the years. However, in more recent times, a more significant link between Ulster and Scotland is football. Many hundreds, perhaps thousands, make that journey, or the Seach, to follow their football teams. The dawn rise, the early boat, the seasickness, the magnificent stadium, the game, the joy, the despair, the late return, more seasickness, and then home. And yet people look at this experience and see only difference. Dramatic divisions, rivalry, and fierce competitiveness. I look at it and I see only similarities. It doesn't matter what team you're supporting, you're simply making that same journey over to Scotland from Ulster that's been made for many thousands of years. When I look at another word, there are a number of words in our local usage here coincides with the main with the use in standard English. There are also a number of words, those with mairn or yin usage or meaning, where we share a wheen of the meanings, but no all of them. I like to look at thick. The most common application in standard English is as a measurement or estimation of density, and this usage is shared with Ulster Scots. Somebody called that a lang blether in Ulster Scots, not a word that I'm particularly keen on. I guess that's a mobile langblether. The most common application is measurement of density, and this usage is shared with Ulster Scots. The fog was wild thick at the back of the mountain last night. There's also a common usage in relation to size. She given me a brave, thick bit of steak. That's a phrase not often heard in Ulster Scots households, I assure you. But where we part company with standard English is the use of thick as an indication of people's character. If an Ulster Scot describes an individual as being thick, that's not a measurement of their IQ or their ability to do differential calculus in their heels. Rather, it's an indication that the person being described is a stubborn individual, not easily given to compromise, a poor prospect in the field of negotiation. The onion, he's as thick as champ. Champ, as the most of you will know, or should be aware, has nothing to do with the shortened address to a successful boxer, but rather a dish of fritters and scallions, that's spring onions, with a drop of good butter over the top, and I'll wash down with a jug of cold buttermilk. This last being optional. Champ is brave pack in a dense, nourishing dish with a habit of sticking to your ribs. I have indulged very well in that champ. Thick here also means a difficult person. A person so described might be highly intelligent, but prone to mood swings, and therefore needing careful handling and the application of diplomatic skills. Thick is often used as a cognate for thran, an adjective used to indicate an awkward individual or job, but also meaning twisted. Its original coming from the word thra, to be awkward or intractable, or given to arguing or hair-splitting. Thank God there's none of that loose in Northern Ireland today. To suggest that him and him's very thick is not to cast aspersions on their intellectual abilities of the gentleman under question, but means instead that the lads in question are friendly. The expression sometimes carries an implication that the friendship might not be a healthy one, and this may be an indication that there's a link to the expression as thick as thieves. Now, that's a Shakespearean term, Elizabethan English. It's lost its meaning of friendship and closeness in England, but we've kept it over here, as we have retained so many medieval practices in Northern Ireland. If a bodie was said to tack it thick, this would not be a signifier of a preference in milkshakes, but rather would carry the meaning that the person in question had taken offence. I argued about the money, and he took it thick. And such a person, having taken it thick, might then tack thick, meaning, having taken offence, they might turn stubborn and nasty. The phrase "the thick of it," from the popular television programme, means the same in Ulster Scots as it does in Standard English, that is, in the middle of it. But perhaps could be better rendered as up to your oxters in it. In other words, sunk in something to the depth of your armpits. The links with Scotland go back to the time of Columba, Columbanus, Comgall, and the established monasteries on either side of the Irish Sea. I'm not a historian, but those evangelical links are maintained to this day. And the common language, oddly enough, is Gaelic, or Scots Gaelic. It's used mainly in the Western Isles and on the west coast of Scotland. The northern parts of the Western Isles have been described as the last bastion of fundamental Calvinism in Britain, with a large number of inhabitants belonging to the Free Church of Scotland, or the even more conservative Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland. But services in these churches are conducted in Scots Gaelic. So sometimes I find it odd that we don't recognise, and the Academy does recognise, that there are links that are not only about Ulster Scots, but are also about Scots Gaelic and Ulster Gaelic. In fact, there's a choir comes over here pretty much every year and tours round singing evangelical hymns and sacred music, but all sung in Gaelic. And there are Gaelic-speaking congregations in the Church of Scotland, but the difficulty actually is finding ministers that speak the language. So that's the problem that's happening there. And the widespread use of English in worship has been suggested as one of the reasons for the decline in the use of Gaelic. The Church of Scotland is a lot more supportive now than it might have been at the time, but they're up against that difficulty of finding ministers who are going to be speaking Gaelic. There have been a number of Scots language versions of the Bible, produced most notably by Lorimer. But unfortunately, the only Ulster Scots version of the part of the Bible, the Book of Luke, was deemed too controversial to be stocked in evangelical bookshops. Go figure, as we say in Ulster Scots, almost. I think part of the reason is that the register of Ulster Scots is regarded as informal. And I think that the difficulty that folk had with it was that to render the sacred word of the Bible into an informal tongue of Ulster Scots was actually disrespectful. And I think that was the difficulty they had. They don't have that difficulty in Scotland. When I was at school, I studied French, German, Latin. It was a long, long time ago. And I was absolutely certain at the time that I learned those languages that I'd never be in France or Germany or, for that matter, ancient Rome. I thought all three were likely destinations. Belfast was about the farthest place my imagination would allow me to travel. This greatly inhibited my study, not helped by being a bit stupid and extremely lazy. Anyway, eventually at the age of 20, I did get to France. I won't detain you with any of the details, but suffice to say that I met some French people. And I detected a poor interaction between my friends and a farmer somewhere in the middle of France. My friends were Parisians, the farmer was a local, and I asked why relations seemed frosty between them. Ah, they said, he looks down on us because we're ignorant city dwellers, and we look down on him because he's an ignorant yokel. I may not have got the translations exactly right there, but that was the gist of what they were saying. Now, in the intervening years, I have come across this metropolitan rural split in virtually every country in the world. People who live in the town, city, be it Belfast, Dublin, London, maintain that same relationship with the rest of the country. They're looked down on by the rest of the country, and they in turn look down on them. And I think this is part of the problem which has dogged Ulster Scots, the ignorant yokel encountering the sophisticated city slicker. I often say that the most vigorous supporters of Ulster Scots that I meet today are exactly the same people who made such sport of the way I talked back in the day. The sophisticated metropolitan elite, or part of it anyway. This was ostensibly changed by the Good Friday Agreement, and that defined our homely tongue as the variety of the Scots language traditionally found in Northern Ireland and Donegal. Keeping alive the tradition of the metropolitan elite looking down on the culture, the ink was hardly dry before the language element began to be diluted. And culture and heritage are promoted ahead of the language. In fact, the term Ulster Scots doesn't feature in the Good Friday Agreement at all. But one of the things that happened was there was a hyphen introduced into Ulster Scots. What in goodness name, you ask, is the significance of the hyphen? Now, before I get to that, I should say that I was reminded of the famous Carrickfergus minister, Dean Jonathan Swift, who told a tale of Lilliput, a land of small people. Noel Card, as in so many cases, had a marvellous aphorism which I like regarding small people. Never trust a man with short legs. His brains are too close to his arse. The people of Lilliput fought the people of Blefuscu for the smallest of things, the right way to crack an egg, the big end or the small end. And the big endians and the small endians went to war against each other because of that disagreement. And the same sort of applies to the hyphen. There are the hyphenate Ulster Scots and the non-hyphenate Ulster Scots. What a change from the days of Dean Swift. Plus ça change, as we almost say in Ulster Scots. Also, the language is cross-community and cross-border. I think those are qualities which didn't quite fit with some folks' agenda. So we see a range of things like kilts and Highland dancing, which really had no connection with the Lowlands or any of the folk that came over. Pipe bands. Well, pipe bands have been flourishing for a long, long time, not only north and south of the border, but right across Britain and right across the world. Canadians, Australians, Americans. And if you've ever seen a police funeral in America, they're always inevitably accompanied by the police pipe band, many of whom I think would regard themselves as either Irish Americans or Scotch-Irish. These things have all been going on for quite a while, and there's also been a focus on the plantation as the birth of Ulster Scots. I'm not sure that I would totally agree with that. A few years ago, I attended a celebration of the Reverend Francis McKeamy held in Donegal. Now, the Reverend Francis McKeamy is a revered figure, not only in Donegal, but also in America. He's the man credited with bringing Presbyterianism to North America. And as part of the celebrations of the Reverend McKeamy, I attended a lecture given by Finlay Holmes. Now, I think Finlay Holmes has maybe passed on now, but he was a very noted Presbyterian historian, and he gave a marvellous talk about the plantation. Yes, the planters had been largely Presbyterian, but not exclusively so. They also had within their ranks Episcopalians, Roman Catholics, and Finlay Holmes was very upset about this. A few atheists may have crossed over as well, people with no religious affiliation whatsoever. So as we often say in the Ullins Academy, things are a lot more complicated than you might think when you look at the situation straight away. So I think it's been going on for quite a while. And when you look at another word, that word is druth. Now, when I was younger, the only heat in winter came from peats that were cut in the summer. Coal was a luxury. And the work of cutting peats, for which, by the way, one required a lurgan spade. Now, a lurgan spade was slightly longer than a normal spade. You may have heard the expression, a face like a lurgan spade, for somebody who's looking a bit down in the mouth. You cut the peats from the bank, you fitted them, you stacked them in castles to dry, and this was an activity inevitably carried out in the moss. The moss, the bog, is inevitably a long way from potable water. And if you felt a druth, and believe me, you did feel a druth, because no matter what the Met Office may tell you, the summers were a lot warmer when I was younger. You were reduced to drinking cold buttermilk, which I've referred to earlier, or cold sweet tea in a bottle stopped with a clean rag, usually made from a bit of Morton's flour bag. That's how I recall druth being dealt with. But this wasn't for everybody. It could be that one of your neighbours, or God forbid, one of your usually wide family circle, was known locally and described as a bit of a druth. This indicated that he, for it was inevitably a he, had a preference for a different solution to the problem of thirst, one which involved waters of a slightly stronger nature than those consumed in the moss, waters of an alcoholic nature. They were occasionally consumed in the moss, but rarely. More often they were consumed in the local hostelry, a Spartan all-male establishment far removed from the theme pubs of today. Oft times there were other druthy individuals present, so inevitably one had companionship at the pub. What Burns referred to in Tam O'Shanter as druthy neighbours, neighbours meet. My mother had a separate relationship with druth that had a lot less to do with liquid refreshment, fortified or otherwise, and much more to do with the weekly wash, or more exactly, the drying thereof. A day with a bit of druth was more likely to dry the clothes on the line. There's a queer truth. There's a queer truth today. I think that part of the difficulty that Ulster Scots has also suffered from is a mindset which I've come across, which sort of says that anything that renders us anything other than as British as Finchley is perceived as a threat to the Union. And allied to this position is an anti-Ulster Scots philosophy which is happy to see it denied any form of funding as long as Irish is similarly deprived of funding. But I think at heart, Ulster Scots is possibly its very own worst enemy. I say that it's a hardy tongue for hardy people. And this was really brought to my mind about 6 or 7 years ago. I was working on the Kist of Words programme. It was James Fenton, the man I talked about earlier. Jim, just to digress a wee minute about Jim. Jim is a guy who comes from about 1.5 miles from where I was reared, though he's slightly older than I am. He attended Dalriada and did very well and got his senior certificate or whatever the equivalent would have been in those days, and he got accepted to Stranmillis. And when Jim got up to Stranmillis, he discovered that the way people talked around him was not the way people talked in Belfast. And he was absolutely fascinated with this. And when he came home, he started to jot down words and phrases that he knew from round that bit of Northampton where we both came from. And that turned into a 30-year task and eventually turned out a book called The Hamely Tongue, which I commend to all of you. It's a wonderful book, very amusing. It's a bit more than a dictionary. It also contains a lot of phraseology and a lot of explanatory uses of the word and the width and use of the words. Anyway, my producer said to me, he says, we'll have to give it a title. He said, we'll have to say something nice about Jim. What would you say nice about him in Ulster Scots? Jeez, I couldn't think of anything. So we immediately repaired to the book, The Hamely Tongue. We consumed it cover to cover. No words of praise at all. I mean, I was really gobsmacked. And, and I sort of thought, it sort of fits in with Northern Ireland. I think we're very quick to criticise, very slow to praise. The solution we came up with eventually was High Haitian of Ulster Scots. That's the nicest phrase we could come up with. Anyway, it set me thinking, and I had a look at one single letter of the alphabet, the letter G. I found 24 separate terms of abuse under the letter G. There's one not mentioned, which I'm familiar with, but I had a chat with Jim about it. He thinks it may be a recent American import, and that word is galoot. And he thinks it was brought over here by the American servicemen during the Second World War. But anyway, I'm going to have a wee run through the 24 terms of abuse under the letter G. Some of them you may know, others you may not. A gaedril. That's a stupid person or a simpleton. Now, by the way, pretty much all these words describe idiots, fools. And so but it's the notion that there's 24 of them under the letter G. A gam, a foolish or light-headed person. A ganch, well, I mentioned that earlier, an empty chatterbox. A gibberloon, that's a clown or an idiot. A glump, that's a fool. One of my favourites. A glunter, that's a dull-witted person, clumsy person, somebody that's easily fooled or taken advantage of. And a glunter puddin', that's exactly the same as a glunter, but somebody who's morbidly obese as well as being stupid. A gome, that's a numbskull. A gomeril, that's a simpleton. A gorb, you may be familiar with the phrase a greedy gorb. That's somebody that likes food. A gornet, that's a greenhorn. A gauche person. A gornicle, that's a ludicrous person. An oddity or a simpleton. A gostron, that's a raw youth. A gouster, a loudmouth blustering person. A growl, a puny, insignificant person, a grouch, a slow, awkward, obese person. They were fond of their grub, the Ulster Scots, weren't they? And they weren't slow about criticising body shapes. A grumph, a surly, scowling person, someone who continually complains. Thank God we have none of those. A gulping, that's a raw youth or a growing boy. I want to focus just for a minute on two of the words under G, which are gipe and glipe. And the third word, which is sort of a homophone but not quite, which is clipe. Now the gipe is a bit of a fool, hyperactive. Think Tigger from Winnie the Pooh, A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh, or maybe Ralph Wiggum from The Simpsons. Somebody a bit simple, not too bright, but innocent and good-hearted. The word itself seems to come from Old Norse. Now, a glipe is also a fool, but Yinwe a wee bit mair what nor the gipe. So when you offered an admonishment to a glipe, such as, give me that here, you glipe you, that's done in an Ulster Scots spirit of helpfulness, an attempt to improve the glipe. There's also a hint that the glipe, having a bit mair between the lugs, might be capable of logical behaviour and also improvement. Which brings me to clipe. It's not quite a homophone, but it's nearly a clipe, and that sometimes renders a clipe clash. I don't know if you've ever come across that word. But it basically means a telltale, a nark, a grass. And it's a term most commonly associated with the schoolyard, but I've heard it used in other wider contexts, but also conveying the same meaning. I personally think there's a decent research project to be had to determine whether the gipe is more likely to clipe on the glipe, or whether the glipe is more likely to clipe on the gipe. A deep Ulster Scots philosophical dilemma. One of the great attractions that I find about the Hamely tongue is the richness that it gives to everyday speech in Northern Ireland or Ulster or whatever your preference happens to be. The analogy that I use is that you only use the smallest wee pinch of oregano on a pizza, but my God, it makes such a difference to your enjoyment of the meal. What are the roots of Ulster Scots? Well, of course, Scots, Standard English, Middle English, Old English, Old Scots, Irish, Irish Gaelic, Scots Gaelic, Norse, Old Norse. There's a wee drop of French, Latin, a lot of German, high, old, low, middle, low, to name but a wheen. Ian, have I got most of the Germans there? I'm glad this. I know you have a particular expertise. There's some Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish. I don't really know a lot about the etymology or the linguistics of it, but essentially I am someone who enjoys it and who really is fascinated by Ulster Scots. And I think it's been a hard old road for Ulster Scots. It does get a lot of abuse. I would ask you to try and look into your hearts and be slightly more broad-minded about it. Now,
Old is Gothic.
say that again.
Old is Gothic. It's one of the oldest words.
You see? There is a story that I tell, and I told it down in Navan Fort about a year ago or a year and a half ago. I was doing a speaking engagement down there. And I told the story about Ulster Scots, but there was a guy there, an Irish speaker, and he said, that's an Irish story. And I've subsequently discovered it's told in a number of areas where there is a language conflict. There was a guy walking down